Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. And believe it or not, this is already part 7 of my Journey to Unguro card review. This time around, I have 3 new cards, including the Rogue Legendary Quest. And let me tell you right now, it's a doozy. It's crazy. I'm not even sure I know what to make of it, but there's certainly a lot to discuss in regards to it. But up first, I do want to look at another Rogue card that will help put the Rogue Legendary Quest in context a little bit. So up first of our 3 cards is the new Rogue spell, Mimic Pod. This is a 3 mana spell that draws you a card and then also adds a copy of that card to your hand. So basically it's draw 2 cards, but it also extends the depth of your deck a little bit and essentially gives you an extra resource that your opponent doesn't really know necessarily what it is until you play the first one. So you can do things like get 2 Edwin Van Cleefs, right? Like that could be pretty silly to play an 8/8 Edwin and then a 10/10 Edwin. 2 SI7 agents, 2 Cold Bloods for an extra 4 damage burst. All kinds of ideas start coming to mind immediately with a card like Mimic Pod. And really, it feels like a solid card to me. Card duplicates, that's an advantage, I think, over just standard cards, as long as you're not looking for something really specific, like one key combo card in your deck. As long as you're happy drawing just about anything, I think that's a bonus over a standard card draw. And this compares very similarly to a card like Arcane Intellect as far as mana cost is concerned and function is concerned. But it's slightly better, in my opinion. It also works for Rogue. So really, I like this card pretty well. I think this is going to be a playable card draw mechanic. Regardless of what kind of deck you're in, this could work in any sort of not face super aggressive Rogue deck. So if it's mid-range or control, this kind of card could definitely have a place. And as you'll see in a second, this card is very good at setting up the Rogue Legendary Quest. So keep this card in mind as we move on to the next card, the Caverns Below. This is our Rogue Legendary Quest. And to complete this quest, it has a very interesting mechanic. You have to play 4 minions with the same name. Now, of course, you can only ever run 2 minions with the same name in a given deck, because you're capped out at 2 identical cards per list. So, to make this quest work, you essentially have to use some sort of card duplication effect, like Mimic Pod, or you have to be able to play a minion and then return it to your hand and play it again. So that means you can, basically there's 2 routes here to satisfying the minion duplication. So there's things like Shadow Step, Youthful Brewmaster, Shadow Caster, Rogue, the Gadget Zan Ferryman, I think is his name. So Rogue actually has quite a few tools available to them to play minions multiple times. We've seen Shadow Step quite a bit as a card that's successful. So it is going to be possible to complete this quest, certainly. It sounds crazy. I like how fun it is. It's technically possible. And if you do complete the quest, your reward is Crystal Core. And that's a 5 mana spell that's added to your hand upon completion of the quest. And for the rest of the game, all your minions are always 5/5s. So this is sort of an aura enhancement effect on the board. If you play a 1/1, it's a 5/5. If you play a 30/30 Cthulhu, it's a 5/5. Everything is a 5/5. So that means really small minions go up in size, really big minions go down in size, which is obviously a downside. So you'd want to run this quest in a deck that essentially utilizes a lot of small minions and low-cost minions probably that have very powerful battle cry effects for 2 reasons. One, if they're small and they have a strong battle cry, in other words, if they're understated but they trade stats for a good battle cry, that's going to work for Crystal Core because you're still going to be able to utilize that battle cry, but they'll also be a 5/5. So you can do things like Novice Engineer, a 2 mana 5/5 that draws you a card. That's crazy. That's like better than Azure Drake, right? But it's only 2 mana. There's 1,000 different examples of great Battlecry cards that don't cost much, and they all get better when you've activated Crystal Core. But the problem here is, and this is a very complicated thing to discuss, so bear with me as I move through this. I just don't think Caverns Below is going to be easy to meet as a condition because there's just so many different variables going into this. Essentially, you draw minions in an unpredictable order, so you might get one copy but not your second copy. You might get 2 copies right away of one minion, but you don't have the Shadow Step or the Youthful Brewmaster or the copy effects to duplicate them, so you have to play them out to get on board and get tempo and keep up with the game. So there's 2 things essentially working against you to complete this quest. In other words, a lot of dominoes are going to have to fall in the perfect order for you to actually be able to play 4 identical minions without losing the game in the process. Because cards like Shadow Step and Youthful Brewmaster, you play a minion, if you pull that minion back, you're usually sacrificing board presence, you're sacrificing tempo, you're sacrificing initiative, and that means it's really hard to win the game. So you have to have some sort of really big swing back in your favor mechanism, and I don't know that Crystal Core is that. I don't know it's strong enough to swing the game back for you because it costs 5 mana itself, which means you're basically passing up a turn to play it, especially if you don't have any minions on board. You don't gain any actual instant benefit from Crystal Core, so you're just sacrificing a whole nother turn to pull it off. And then even then, your next turn, you're probably playing minions that don't have charge or aren't instantly activated, so you're kind of sitting there for another turn, giving your opponent basically 2 free turns to do whatever they want, include hit you in the face and kill you, plus you've been sacrificing board presence the entire time to get to that point, so you've probably given up like 4 or 5 quality turns trying to pull off what I think is ultimately a gimmick effect with no real payoff because your opponent just wins the game by the time you do it. Now clearly, there are going to be situations where this works out perfectly. You draw everything on curve and it's just absolutely nuts. It's tons of fun. You can do things like play 1 mana Southsea deck hands that are 5/5 chargers, which is absurd. You can play a card like Morose, which now is suddenly a 5/5 stealth minion that summons a 5/5 every single turn. And that's crazy too. I get it. There's a lot of fun stuff that can happen here, but I really do think this is going to be more of a highlight type card where you try to do fun, interesting, crazy things, and probably not the foundation of a competitive deck. Now, I'd love to be proven wrong. I want cards to be successful. I hope somebody finds a really magically consistent way to make the Caverns Below work, and perhaps we'll see even more cards released later here in the reveals that make it even more likely. I welcome that completely, but as it stands right now, knowing the cards that we know, even with a card like Mimic Pod added to the pool, even with the Thistleteas of the world, I still don't think there's enough consistency to make the Caverns Below good. So as much as I like the idea of this card, as interesting as the quest mechanic is because it makes you think about the game in a different way and build a really specific, fun kind of deck, I just don't think it's viable. So we'll see this probably the first week of Journey to Unguro as people play around with it and test it out, but I think it'll go away pretty quickly, and the Caverns Below will be lost to the Caverns Below where Hearthstone cards don't see light of day. So let's move on to the third and final card in this review. This is a new Paladin Minion, the 2-mana 2/2 Murloc, Hydrologist. And I think this is Sir Finley Murgleton's girlfriend, if you ask me, because she appears to be a girl, rosy cheeks, kind of, puffy lips, feminine figure, as far as Murlocs can have a feminine figure. Plus, she's got a hat, just like Sir Finley. So one of the few dressed Murlocs we're familiar with, so I'm assuming she has to be friends with Sir Finley. She also has a cute little frog behind her. All of this is completely relevant to the review, by the way. It's really important that we analyze the art to great detail. But let's actually talk about the card here. She has a battle cry, Discover a Secret. And essentially that makes her, in many ways, a Dark Peddler. This is a really similar card to Dark Peddler. You get a 1-mana spell every time if you're a Paladin when you play this, and it's a 2-mana 2/2. Dark Peddler is a solid card. Gets a lot of play. The 1-drops you get from Dark Peddler obviously have a wider array of choices, some of which are better than Paladin Secrets, but sometimes you get bummer Dark Peddler draws too, so sometimes Hydrologist is actually going to be more consistent. So as much as Paladin has good secrets in the pool, which it has a few decent ones and a few weak ones, this card could be playable, especially in any sort of Murloc Paladin that likes early game Murlocs that do something cool. So I like the card, good design, strong enough to see play in a vacuum, but I have to say I don't know what deck this card fits into right now. I don't see an early game Murloc Paladin as a thing. We've seen late game combo style Murloc Paladins, but anything can happen as a card that's rotating out, so that's not an option here. We've seen the water package successful in a lot of decks with Finja the Flying Star and Murloc War Leaders and all that fun stuff, but this is a card that would reduce the consistency of that package. So outside of maybe just a generic mid-range Paladin or maybe a buff Paladin with some Murlocs added in, I don't really know where this card goes. So I like it. It's probably a good card at its root, but I'm not actually sure it's one that we'll see play simply because it doesn't seem to have a home right now and probably won't in Paladin unless, again, we haven't seen all the cards, so that's always a caveat. If there's more cards added that support Hydrologist, definitely a playable card in my mind. So there you have it. That wraps up my review. If you have any thoughts, comments, or questions about these cards, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to read and address as many as I can. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.